we're pleased to present somebody from Ogilvy and Mather today. The advocacy study was something that they had worked on with us over the recent months, and it's some really exciting information, but we want to talk about what is advocacy first off. And then what we want to do is really dive a little bit deeper into advocacy and say, why should people care about advocacy, and who is it that really cares about, being an advocate, right? And then we'll move forward on to talking about what actually drives advocacy within organizations, and also the different advocacy drivers across geographies and industries and some other pivots that I think you'll find very, very interesting. Then we'll move into some recommendations. Hopefully what you'll do after this session today is you'll walk away with 4, 5, 2 very concrete things that you can think about implementing within your business. So we want to talk about some of those recommendations, and then give you some even more tangible things that you could do to get started to build advocacy and manage advocacy within your customer base and within your prospect base. And then we'll wrap up with Q&A. As I had said earlier, we've been working with Ogilvy on this over the last few months, and we're lucky to have Irfan Kamal with us. He's a Senior Vice President over at Ogilvy, and I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on him in just a second. We also have Vangel, and she is with Visible Technologies. She runs our Insight Services team in addition to a couple of other teams within our organization. I'm going to come back to her in just a second also. But before we do that, I wanted to ask a very quick poll question. What we're trying to understand before we get into the session today that'll be very helpful for us in the way we pose things is we're trying to understand the importance of sentiment analysis within your organization, and also where you are right now with sentiment analysis in your organization. So we've got a quick poll for you that you should see on the right-hand side of your screen right now. What we want to know is, where does your organization fit, right? Do you not measure sentiment regularly and because it's not important to you? That would be response number A. Do you not measure it, but it's actually something that is very important to you, and you know you need to start doing it, and you know you need to govern it in a different way? Do you measure it regularly right now, but it's not really important outside the social organization or the marketing organization? And finally, the nirvana would be, you do measure it regularly, and it is broadly important to your organization. So if you could take just a second to answer some of those questions, I'm going to give a little bit more detail to our presenters today. Like I said, Irfan is a Senior Vice President with Ogilvy and Mather based in their Washington, D.C. office. He's been working with Fortune 500 and entrepreneurial companies for the last 15 years on product development, on marketing and brand management, and we're really, really lucky to have him here today as the author of this Ogilvy study. And then Vangel has been working with Visible for a number of years now, has over 15 years of experience working in both digital research and also working in social media analytics. As I said earlier, she's responsible for our Insight Services team, which is really the team that works with our clients to really get deep into the social media data and really drive those insights that will help you improve your business and your competitive abilities. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the poll here real quick, and I want to share some of the responses with you. It's updating some of the things right now. But it looks like what we have is about the people that actually clicked a response. The majority of the people came back with D. You do measure it regularly, and it is broadly important. Trending down to, it looks like maybe 20% of the population saying it's not important. You do not measure it right now, and it's not very important to your organization. But the majority of the people have responded with, it is very important to your org, and you do measure it regularly. So that's good to know. I think what you're going to get out of the session today is really some insights about what is different between sentiment and advocacy, and it will be very insightful for you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to pass the ball over to Irfan, and he is going to walk through the presentation today. Irfan, the ball is yours.
Great. Thanks, Rich. So hello, everybody. This is Irfan Kamal at Ogilvy. And I'm going to walk you through how to build a global fashion brand. And this is a really exciting study that we did and published just a couple months ago around brand advocacy, which is increasingly an important area for us. So I'll just also briefly give Michelle a chance to talk a little bit. Visible Technologies was one of our key partners in this study. We analyzed about over 7 million mentions across 4 different countries, the US, UK, China, and Brazil. And so for that, we really required some very powerful analytics tools that could not only collect a lot of this data, but actually allow us to derive some meaningful insights around it. So, Michelle, do you want to talk a little bit about the project and your sort of thoughts about it?
Sure. No, that would be great, Irfan. Thank you. So we were really excited to work with Irfan and his team because, as social continues to evolve beyond monitoring and listening and really driving business results in applying social intelligence to many different parts of the organization, we're working with a lot of clients who are looking at data in new ways and really transcending the standard KPIs where we all started out with, a couple of years ago in terms of boiling the ocean and looking at share of voice and looking at positive and negative discussion. And really, we are moving towards looking at purchase paths and applying different segmentations and understanding perceptions among particular audiences, looking at behavioral and attitudinal segmentations, things like that. I mean, really, we're moving to a whole new sphere in terms of social intelligence, and what Irfan's team was approaching with this project was just a great fit with our overall point of view and the work that we're doing. So this is a really great presentation, and the work that his team has done with the support of our team and our tools, I think, is going to be really insightful for all.
Right. So centrally, just a bit of background additionally. So Social Ogilvy is a group of over 500 people throughout Ogilvy's global network, and we all focus on social in some aspect, whether it's the paid part of it around ad buying and media, or whether it's earned or owned social implementation. So this is very important for us, and what we really wanted to do is understand this, and here's why. So centrally, what we are facing is an environment where some of our top clients, executives, are unable to have all the data that helps them make the types of decisions that would be best. And so let's talk about the hypothetical scenario that reflects what we often run across. So in this case, the CMO of a global hotel brand is suffering from a social advocacy gap. And this gap will actually cost him business and put him behind the competition. He has great brand favorability scores, tremendous brand satisfaction, but if he's not inspiring people to share and advocate for the brand, the fact is he's missing one of the most persuasive purchase drivers and the ingredient that can bring some significant marketing efficiencies, which we'll talk about more in a second. So what the social advocacy gap is essentially the difference between the overall brand satisfaction, which is something that a lot of us track for our brands, and the actual advocacy around the brand. So, and here we define advocacy as people talking about the brand. So in this case, our CMO had great brand satisfaction, even awesome scores. People love staying there, but at the same time, they found that a very small % of the people that were actually satisfied with the brand were talking about it. So they essentially had this gap and opportunity to change the way that people interact and focus around their brand. So what are some of the ways that we look at and define advocacy? So we look at advocacy on the spectrum from casual brand advocacy through to passionate advocacy. So casual advocacy could be every time a Facebook fan likes something or shares something interesting, or when they retweet a link without adding any comments. Passionate advocacy, in comparison, is a outpouring of support, a glowing recommendation, a 4 or 5-star review, an enthusiastic thumbs up for the brand and the product. So when asked for a recommendation on a new car, for example, a passionate advocate leans forward, is enthusiastic about their new, let's say, Ford Fusion, and they go into the details around Sync or MyTouch. So they have a lot of excitement and passion for the brand. So one is casual, one is implied endorsement, and the other is personalized and explicit. And of course, there's a world of information in between. So what is the opportunity here? So imagine for a second if you could get every customer you have today to gain one new customer simply by advocating and recommending your product or service. And let's say, you know, that's not even one customer. So let's say every existing customer gets, every 2 customers get 1 customer. We're still talking about increasing your sales by 50 to 100%, a number somewhere in between or even less. It's a very substantial amount, potential increase in sales, volume consumption, which drives sales. So simply driving this increased recommendation around your brand can make your marketing significantly more efficient. So imagine what this really means in terms of the numbers. So we look a lot at Ogilvy at marketing efficiency and metrics around business impact of social. I think we all have moved to the point where social isn't just about fans or engagement. It's really about thinking if we're going to double, triple our investment in this channel, as we should given the prevalence of consumer attention to this channel, what is the impact? So here's really where around advocacy, imagine achieving a substantially higher level of growth with the same or perhaps even a bit less spending than your competitors. So social advocacy really promises that through the combination of higher reach, which is generated by advocates, and also greater conversion. One thing that happens, we found, when people recommend a brand to their product, to their friends or colleagues, we found click rates or conversion rates as high as 4 to 5 times higher through a friend or family or colleague recommendation compared to a simple media placement. So there's a very big difference in this, which promises efficiency, and that's the promise, and that's why we did this study and why we thought it's so important. So let's dive into some of the details of what specifically we found. So one key thing is we looked at approximately 22 different brands, and we looked at it across different categories like skincare, coffee, hotels, and fashion. And what we found was pretty surprising to us. One is that no category is boring enough to not drive a significant volume of advocacy. So if you look at the data here, what we found is that amongst the top 10 drivers of advocacy, we found hotels among them, we found coffee, and we found skincare to be some of the biggest things, and a couple fashion brands as well. So we actually found that there was substantial excitement about categories that one would perhaps not expect to drive advocacy at the levels that one might think.
So Irfan, if I might, it's really interesting that you state that no category is too boring, because we work with many clients across some industries that I think might beg to differ with you in terms of not seeing a lot of really enthusiastic discussion around things like homeowners insurance or mutual funds. And on the flip side, you know, it's always surprising to our analysts to see the number of people who are inspired to take the time to post about things like floor cleaners, for example. And so I'm just curious, do you think there are certain industries where advocacy is more important than others, where purchase decisions are more heavily inspired by other people's opinions?
That's a great question. What we found, again, it's a lot of it is through actual trial and error and experimentation. So we found that it really depends on the company. So we actually looked at trying to understand what these drivers were of advocacy across these different industries. And interestingly, every category had top performers and performers that frankly didn't make the cut. So I think that there's a tremendous amount of variability, and it's not, I think the jury's out. It's far too early to say, really, because brands haven't really, in general, done a great job at encouraging and leveraging advocacy throughout their ecosystem. I think it's far too early to say whether or not there's one category that works and another that doesn't. We've really found that it's effective and useful across a lot of categories, and it really depends on the energy and the type of strategy, frankly, that the brand adopts. As one example, what we saw was we actually included movies in the list of brands we looked at, or products. So we had 8 movies we looked at, and we found that overall, the majority of brand mentions were casual. So remember, we talked about casual versus passionate advocacy. What we found is that in general, people were pretty casual about their mentions. However, we found, and this is a look at the US brands, we found 2 brands, Kimpton and Kiehl's, that actually stood out and have had well over 50% of mentions falling into that highly passionate area. And interestingly, so one is a skincare brand and one is a hotel. Interestingly, these brands actually came out and had more enthusiastic advocacy than some top movies that you'd really expect, like Hunger Games with a really devoted follower base, and of course Avengers with a fairly substantial franchise. So it's clear that there is really the opportunity for brands to drive this sort of excitement and passion in a way that's pretty impressive, but not all are doing it. Again, what we saw is a few standouts, but by and large, there wasn't a huge level of passion amongst most brands. And we actually found, diving deeper, that there were actually differences in countries. So if you look at the detail, we found that out of all the countries we looked at, China actually had the highest level of brand advocacy. So tremendous excitement around brands in social media in China. We saw about over twice the level, for example, compared to the US and UK, and 5 times the level of Brazil. Interestingly, if you look at passion, though, the levels were different. So it suggests that there are some other factors here. US and UK came in highest on passion, and we actually talked to some of our colleagues in China about these findings, and there was some thoughts around this that suggested that part of it might be cultural, and there may be also differences in how people communicate there, so that there was a really high volume around brands, but there wasn't necessarily the same passion level, which we found in the US and UK, which obviously have a different sort of cultural mix. So one of the other big things that we found, and I'm not sure the transition here is working properly, but one other big thing that we found here, we looked at advocacy mentions around 5 categories. So we looked at advocacy mentions around ads, benefits, features, costs and deals, and customer services. And what we wanted to see is which one actually drove the biggest advocacy. And you can't tell because of this animation issue here, but essentially what we found was very surprising. We found that a rational thing like features actually ended up driving the most advocacy. So features are things like the SPF characteristic of a skin cream, you know, the miracle ingredient, or the space of a hotel room. So these things that are very rational actually drove the most advocacy. And we found things like benefits, which are more emotional, came in a fairly distant number 2 in most, in every market we looked at. And so there was really this focus, and if you think about it, you know, each of you might have some interesting ideas on this. It's really that people like to share things which are useful to their friends, or in some way interesting and relevant, and it's more easy to share features than it is to share emotions when it's around most products. So, and it varied again. This is a general finding. What is important is for each brand to look at what's important for their brand. There were some exceptions. In the coffee category in Brazil, for example, deals and savings were a bigger driver. And in the skincare category in China, there were about as many mentions of ads, a bit less, but as references to features. So a few differences if you look at different regional markets. So if we dive a bit deeper into advocacy drivers by country, you can get the sense that advocacy drivers were about 15% of all brand mentions. And if you look at the breakdown, then we pointed out that in China, for example, you have this difference between features and then ads coming in second, whereas in some other markets, for example, in Brazil here, it turns out that things like cost actually play a big factor in driving advocacy, so people will talk more about deals. But again, features still trump most of them in most markets, which is interesting, and we'll talk about a bit more when we get into some of our recommendations. We have 4 or 5 of those that came out of this study.
I like this one, Irfan, as well. I mean, we work with a lot of global brands where they're always looking for ways to better understand kind of what's driving engagement at a regional level. And just, I was curious in terms of looking across the different products and so forth and cost. Did it matter if it's the cost of a cup of coffee or the cost of a hotel room? Did that impact findings overall, or was there any variance, you know, across category or by country?
That's great. We actually didn't find variance across categories as much. There was a little bit of variance. But again, what we found, and we'll talk about in a second, is that there were more variations between specific brands. And if you think about it, that's all about market. That makes sense, because in marketing, our key focus often is to differentiate our products from those of competitors. So what we found is that there were variations in what popped, for example, for one coffee or one hotel or one skin cream against another. And it wasn't so much on a category-by-category basis. We actually found fairly consistently that features were number 1, and there was some variation, though, in number 2. But overall, what's most interesting to me is that there's a lot of differences across brands. So if you start thinking about it, what is the opportunity here? And so one of the key things that we found is that it's really important, to your point, Michelle, it's really important to understand what is the driver around your specific category and what are the things that specifically your brand stands out. So recommendation number 1 is to drive really passionate advocacy, know and focus on your fans' true advocacy, and that's not the same often as brand satisfaction survey data, inspirations. So as a couple of examples here, for hotels, we found, for example, that Kimpton really popped on customer service. They also, so they over-indexed on that. They also over-indexed a bit on benefits. But the thing that was most marked was on customer service, which makes a lot of sense if you've been at a Kimpton and if you've experienced some of those things. And again, we found other hotels had different things that really differentiated them. In terms of advocacy, again, I'm not talking about brand satisfaction, I'm talking about what people found talkable enough about the brand that they would talk about. And if we look at that for skincare, what we found was something different. We found that versus the skincare average in the U.S., Kiehl's had over-indexed by quite a bit on features. So there was a lot of discussion around the features of the skin creams and some of the attributes that they had compared to other brands. And if you look at that, they under-indexed on some other areas like cost, and that's really interesting to understand because it really helps us better understand where we are developing, not the internally driven marketing position that we've developed within the company, but what do consumers really care enough about our brands to actually share? So that's some really interesting data that you can pull on when you start understanding these advocacy drivers. So as you dive deeper into this, because it's so important, one of the key things that you start to understand and want to pull out is understand specific, very granular topics that influence advocacy. So in this example, we found that, for example, the thing that popped the most for Hilton was its breakfast amongst all the different categories we looked at. And in the listening software, we were able to understand that Kimpton, for example, had the bar be one of the key things that drove advocacy. And I think a lot of people, again, who stayed at these hotels have a sense of that, yeah, this makes sense. It seems to resonate with what we think. And in some cases, it actually is a little bit different than one would expect, and there isn't a focus that we'd expect, and that's also useful. But again, so the second recommendation really is use your listening to really clearly understand what is the differentiated driver of advocacy for your brand. So how can we really leverage that? The third one is really looking at what we do in terms of global campaigns or even regional campaigns. So if you're running a campaign or producing content in a content studio for social that's focused around global programs, and often many of us focus on a mix of global and local content. Globally, our biggest focus was product features. So if I were running a campaign that I wanted to have the most advocacy potential, again, understanding there may be differences between brands, and you should be aware of those, I would generally focus on highlighting a differentiation based on features. However, to the extent that I'm able to develop or customize content for specific markets, there were a couple examples where, for example, in Brazil, we found that cost was a bigger driver, and we might run a slightly different program there. And we found in China that advertising mentions were a big advocacy driver, again, second to features. So, and if you dive deeper into categories, you can additionally derive data, and we've looked into other categories to try to understand that. And in our study, we were able to understand, for example, skincare over-indexed a lot in China around ads. So we can use that data and then use it to inform the content and the creative approach we take. And then the fourth recommendation is really around understanding what advocacy is as opposed to sentiment. So sentiment is simply a positive, negative, neutral. It's interesting, but not as useful as being able to pull out brand advocacy levels, let's say high, medium, low levels. And I'll talk in a second about how do we actually operationalize this. But pulling out levels by quality, by geo, we've even done it by audiences for a client where we pull out brand advocacy amongst specific target audiences or demos. and then we're able to get a better understanding of how we're moving the needle and what the opportunity and what, from an actionable perspective, what are the keywords and topics that are driving advocacy the most amongst different keywords. So moving beyond this relatively blunt metric of sentiment to tracking brand advocacy has been something that we find a better path forward and a much more strategic one. And then finally, one of the key things that we found, obviously, is that the volume of advocacy is simply not there. So I talked a little bit about the advocacy gap. It turns out we actually looked in depth at hotels and movies, and it turns out that of all the opportunities to advocate, and let's call an opportunity to advocate as a movie or a view or a visit to a hotel room. So we counted up all those opportunities, and then we looked at actually how many public social media mentions are coming out of those brands. And we found that less than 1%, in some cases far less than 1%, of opportunities to advocate were being leveraged. So most brands have what this social advocacy gap, where they're simply not generating the levels of brand advocacy that could really move the needle on sales and intent and brand metrics. It's just not reaching that, and in fact, it's far from that goal. So some of the ideas around encouraging and enabling advocacy are the following. So one is to drive increased volume. So think about the customer journey and the touch points, and think about what are all the opportunities that we can drive advocacy. So identify those points and put in, and in fact request your consumers and customers to advocate for the brand. As you know, nothing, if you don't ask, you won't get in many cases, and that's entirely true here. We have a lot of data that shows that when you ask people to share, they're more likely to share than when you simply put out content and expect them to share. The second point is around passion. So the first was around volume. The second is around passion. So we actually segment customers for our clients into different levels of advocates. So, and we segment by influence and potential advocacy value into different tiers. And then we're able to separate out and identify the most passionate ones and create different strategies for them compared to ones we identify who are more casual or less influential to us. And then finally, once we have these mentions, how do we increase the reach? So a core aspect of this final thing is something that we are increasingly doing, which is scaling up earned using paid. So what we're able to do there is make sure that the level of brand advocacy, no matter what it is, actually scales and reaches a high level. So simply think of how do you take all that great earned content and scale it up so it reaches millions or tens of millions of people, or hundreds of thousands if you're in a smaller B2B audience, so that it does influence attitudes and result in sales and business impact for you. So those are 5 key recommendations around thinking about brand advocacy, and that's hopefully those are helpful to get you started.
So these are great, Irfan. So in terms of how people, get started and take some of these learnings and apply them to what they're doing, what would you say first steps are?
So I put out 3 steps. So the first step that I would say is setting up a listening tool to start tracking brand advocacy. We actually, when we did this initial study, and since then we've been developing this for our other clients, we created a starter set of keywords, and there are about 600 different keywords that we created to identify different levels of advocacy in different categories and brands across. We did in our study, we had about 22 brands. So we use those 600 plus keywords then to separate brand advocacy into different levels, such as high, medium, low. And then we're able to go and start measuring against those advocacy levels. And then we also put in, this is just a small sampling of those, and then we also put in a lot more that are brand specific or category specific, but we also maintain comparability. So we're able to do that as a first step. So then based on that, you're able to start tracking. So here's where you would track advocacy and look at the gaps. So you'd compare yourself against competitors. You track maybe on a quarterly basis what is the progress in terms of moving the needle on your brand, the difference between your brand satisfaction level on the one hand and your brand advocacy level on the other hand. And that would be a core metric that you as an organization at the CMO level would say, what is the brand advocacy? How much of my reach am I generating via advocacy today? That's a key metric that increasingly we're starting to look at. And then finally, Michelle is going to talk through some areas specifically around getting started here. But I would add that one other thing that we often look at is what are some of the key drivers around, to the extent that you can get actionable. We then build out lots of topics amongst audiences that provide us a lot more detail on specific opportunities for content development and campaign creative.
And Michelle, before you dive into this slide, a little bit of context for it. There was a question that was submitted that I think sets this slide up pretty well. Somebody had asked the question, how do I actually identify true advocates in a tool, and how do I actually promote passion and advocacy within social media? So I think that's a question of just the very tangible, how does this work within a tool, and what types of tools and analytic pivots and things like that are available to me that will help me drive passion and advocacy?
Sure. So I think, that does really give the context and set that up well. But in terms of identifying advocacy, I think it's a matter of using the foundational, categories that Irfan has set up. So looking at different ways that people talk about advocacy and the different levels of the strength of emotion in the words that they use. So being able to create those buckets and to be able to identify where that advocacy is happening. So as Irfan said, instead of, looking at that broadly, the way that we would do it is look at it, through various lenses. So looking at, the channels, looking at the particular topics, looking at the audiences, and understanding who are the advocates, what are the advocacy drivers, where is the advocacy discussion happening. So trying to answer those questions and looking at it through various ways to filter the overall conversations. So really being able to set up a dashboard to look at the various advocacy levels, and whether you call that a passion index or an advocacy index, and being able to understand, as I said, kind of the who, what, where, when, and why, and being able to leverage that, as Irfan has said, in terms of being able to then amplify that content through various channels that you have at your fingertips. So it would vary on the particular set of circumstances, but definitely being able to leverage that on your Twitter accounts, your Facebook pages, and so forth, and being able to share and expand that reach. And so in our platform, we also have ways to measure that amplification and the total reach across as well, so you understand the impact of your efforts. So that's really step one. And then in terms of, comparing your competitive position, so I think this is pretty standard, looking at your own, content and conversation in a vacuum, and is pretty much navel gazing and doesn't give you a lot of insight beyond your own results. I mean, you really need to understand where you fit into the competitive landscape, and being able to understand how your advocacy drivers differ from your competitors. And back to one of the key points I think that Irfan said is, even within a category, your particular advocacy driver is not what your competitors are. So differentiating between the Hilton and the Kimpton example, the bar versus the breakfast, but being able to focus on what those are and leverage those and feed into them, if you will, so that you're providing as many opportunities as possible to leverage what you've identified. And then being able to really apply some of those insights in terms of the things that Irfan also mentioned in terms of content strategy and message development and being able to apply to various parts of your marketing plan and being able to include those in your engagement strategies and so forth, just to be able to maximize what your advocacy levels are and to improve them. So once you kind of are understanding the levels of passion across all of those particular drivers, you can understand where your opportunity might be to actually enhance that lever and to increase the amount of advocacy once you see that opportunity.
Great. What we want to do is we want to open it up for a broader Q&A discussion now. Thank you very much for that additional information, Michelle. That was great. And we had a question come in that says, I'm not clear on how one measures advocacy. Is it a measure of the number of times you're recommended or talked about in social media in a passionate way? And I'll open that up to both Irfan and Michelle and interject a little bit of my own thought here, actually more of a question. So is it really as simple as saying, if we set up a dashboard that looks for these types of terms, accomplished, amazed, amazing, etc., and we count the number of times that we're actually mentioned in that type of way, does that count as a truly passionate post? And would we say, success, we made it over a certain number of passionate posts? I think it's a very, very practical question. What is it that you're actually measuring that will make you know you're going in the right direction? And I'll open that up to both Michelle and Irfan for comment.
So I can start, so it's a great question. We actually spent a lot of time fine-tuning our keywords. So every time we start this with a new brand, we go through a fairly iterative process. We start with our base set of keywords, and then we refine them to make sure that we're tracking. We look at all the results. We look at the ones we missed, the ones we captured. And the idea then is to get a good sense of, in public social, to the extent that it's tracked with the tool, that we're getting a good measure of the advocacy level. So we would take these, this is obviously all the public social mentions. We also separately look at more, I guess I'd call them more programmatic or more hard metrics of advocacy. So these are things like, and these are all casual things. So so they would be things like number of times people like content or likes of YouTube videos or pins and so on. So these are all casual advocacy level metrics, but they're very different from these public expressions of advocacy, which are really the ones that you're tracking here. So there are really two levels of tracking. One is around these keywords, keyword-created advocacy ratios, and then there's also a separate layer of tracking, which is around getting all the data from Facebook Insights and YouTube and Instagram data and so on, and using that as another metric to be able to track a bit more around that.
Great. Michelle, do you have any thoughts?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think, Michelle or Irfan, what I take away from that is that once you get to where you want to be, if you're using the right types of tools, it can be a fairly straightforward thing to measure passion. But what I take away from it is that it takes a while to understand what really is passion for you and your company, and what is it that is driving the results that you want. And that takes a lot of time. That could take a lot of different searches to understand the terms and, is it product features? Is it customer service? Is it deals? Do we want it to be any of those things? It's not as prescriptive as saying, it's these 7 words, because every company could have a different set of words and a different vision for what passion truly is. And getting that insight out of social media is something that does take time and takes investment.
Yep.
Okay. Great. Michelle, did I hear you were on mute? Did you have a response to that? The tactical, how do we get at passion?
No, I mean, I think what you are just elaborating on makes sense. And also what we've done with many of our clients is once we have actually spent the time to actually build those foundational, buckets, those categories for not only what the levels of advocacy are, but also those overlays in ways that we want to view those. What we do is often, set up a template that will actually automate that. So it's a download process that actually updates that index, and it really can be very automated and quick once we've done the setup on it. So it's not as laborious and time-consuming as it might seem, because once you've got it established, it's a very quick process to understand how things are shifting over time and where your opportunities are.
Great. Irfan, I've got one more question here that I think is kind of an interesting one. It says, what's the role of loyalty programs in building passion? Do they really serve to build passion, or are they something that really just gives me a free room every once in a while in the hotel example? What's the role of membership programs and other loyalty types of programs in building passion?
I think that's a fantastic question. I also see a question which is a bit related in a way here around trying to inspiring more advocacy, but it's hard to sell because people are worried about instigating negative comments. So there's actually a little overlap there, and here's where it is. I think that we need to rethink loyalty programs. I do not think the way that they're currently structured is focused on brand advocacy. It is focused on individual spend. It's focused, everything around it is around an individual, highly individualized experience. The offers you get are related to what you do. So I think a key thing that we are starting to do, and we actually ran a program with a large consumer electronics brand where we created a community just for their most passionate fans. And these are essentially people that we will call, it's basically the equivalent of a social loyalty program. So it's not a traditional elite program, but it's expanded in a way that focuses on what people's social influence and value to the brand is. And so we actually identified these people. We looked through a lot of loyalty data for this particular client. We connected it up with their social profiles, and we were then able to create a program focused around social loyalty that was very different than traditional loyalty. So I think the big, and we got great results out of that because we were focused, it was built around social as a core instead of as an add-on. So it was really very different than your traditional loyalty program. So I think, to answer your question, I really don't think traditional loyalty programs are really the answer here. I don't think that they're effective, especially in driving advocacy. They're great at driving loyalty, but we need to rethink and do things differently, which is some of the directions we're trying to head, and we've done a couple pilot programs which have been tremendous there.
Great, thanks a lot. There were a few more other questions that had come through, but I think most of them we had been able to address via slides that came up later in the presentation post the question being answered. So I think we'll go ahead and.
Sorry. Yeah. I just want, there was this other question which is about how do that we'd like to inspire more advocacy and integrate social media into touch points, but it's hard to sell because internal people are worried that it'll drive more negative discussion. So I just want to respond to that briefly. So I think that two things. One is try to build programs that focus on your most satisfied customers and driving advocacy from those. So that's one way to address that. The second is there will always be some negative comments, but there are some great studies that show that that's actually not a bad thing. To have some negative comments is a good thing because people are otherwise suspicious of what they're reading. So there's actually data that says having a certain percentage of negative comment will actually increase your conversions and sales compared to having all positive comments about your brand.
Great. Thank you very much for catching that last Q&A there, Irfan. That was great. Well, I don't see any more Q&A or chat notes here. So what we can do is we just want to kind of wrap it up a little bit. Hopefully everybody got a lot out of this presentation. I know that I personally found a couple of things in there that I know we can go back and think about, some of the things along the lines of, what are the things that are really driving advocacy. And I think in any company, if you go around and ask, what is it that drives advocacy, depending on who you're talking to, you'll get different answers. If you talk to R&D, they may say that it's all about features and functionality. If you talk to the customer service people, they'll say that it's all about, engagement, when there's an issue, and that will drive advocacy. All of these are potential areas that Irfan had highlighted, but I think the importance of drilling into what actually is driving it for your organization, how that reinforces your value proposition, how it increases your ability to compete, are all fantastic questions that people can take back and really start to challenge other people in their organization with. So thank you very much, Michelle and Irfan, for those insights.
Thank you.
For those of you who don't know really anything about Visible, we wanted this to be more about things that you can learn and take back to your organization, but do want to tell you a little bit about Visible and then also give you an idea of some other events that we have coming up. Visible is one of the leading social media analytics platforms out there. We've really built our value proposition around two primary things. One is having the data that you can trust, so minimizing things like spam and things like that will be part of your analysis set. And then also adding the insights and the industry expertise, working with people like those on Michelle's team to drive those insights that help you understand things like advocacy versus other tools that are able just to tell you things about straight sentiment, okay? There's a client list here. You can see we've worked with some of the best brands in the business. We've been working with Ogilvy and a number of their clients for a number of years now, and it's been a fantastic relationship. Real quick, in closing, we have a couple of things coming up I wanted to let you know a little bit about, and you can find them on our webpage. If they're not there now, they'll be there soon. But on October 30th, we're going to be doing a report on how to harness small data for strategic advantage, which is all about deep analysis. And we're working with the Digital Clarity Group, which is an analyst firm based out of Boston. Starting on November 20th, we're going to be running an executive insight series where we'll be getting together on a monthly basis, really talking about a very specific business problem and how you can solve that business problem by really driving deep insights within social media. Much more about things that you can take back to your organization, a little bit about how Visible can enable some of that analysis for you. And then, of course, looking at visibletechnologies.com is always great to find previous webcast intelligence reports and things like that. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and we look forward to seeing you on one of our events in the future. Take care.